Why do some people not improve despite the very best treatment? Why don't they get better? They may have the best the medical system can offer. They may have the best that the natural healthcare system can offer, but they don't get better. Or why do some people improve to a certain point, something happens, and then they crash and never improve again? And why do some people that just seemingly healthy have something happen to them, a virus, a bacteria, or some environmental insult, and they just can't get over it and can't get straightened out? Even though the virus or the bacteria is cleared from their system, they just keep going downhill with their health. Why does that happen? I want to answer that today. So the answer is not in genetics, because if the answer were in genetics, we would see it early in life. So our genes make specific DNA sequences that code for different proteins in the body, and it causes us to make the wrong proteins. So if we're making the wrong proteins, we're going to see that early in our life. But there is something called epigenetics. And epigenetics is the study of how our lifestyle and our stresses can cause changes in how our genes work. In other words, we have the same genetics. So if my arm here is a DNA sequence, I have the same DNA sequence, but epigenetics determines, does this gene express or does it not express? Does it express or not? Is it turned on or is it turned off? That's what epigenetics does, and it's very, very powerful tool to understand. And so epigenetics determines when the proteins are made and the timing of them. And I'll give you an example of that more in a moment. So in addition to diet and lifestyle, emotional stress is a big trigger for our epigenetics. And so is the environment, viruses, bacteria, toxins. So our lifestyle can be strong enough to handle these epigenetic changes until something occurs and it backsets us. So we can have inherited predispositions. So that's an amazing thing to understand about this also, is that back in our family, certain stresses could have occurred, certain viral exposures, certain toxins happened, and that expressed epigenetically. And we know as scientific ways that this happens with methylation. It's called histone modification, non-coding RNA, big terms, but I just want you to know it's not just a vibrational energy frequency. It actually happens on a DNA expression level. And so these predispositions to disease can happen in our family. They can lie dormant or unactivated until we ourselves are exposed to a virus, a bacteria, or a significant emotional stress, and then they activate. So let's look at some examples of this. We know there was a lot of work on a famine in the Netherlands in 1944 to 1945, and they followed people for several generations and all the changes that those people had in terms of obesity, in terms of many other issues. We know that 9/11 survivors, their children, even though they weren't present at 9/11, have more PTSD symptoms than other people. An easy one to talk about is a study in mice. So they took little mice, they gave them the smell of cherry blossoms, and then they shocked their feet at the same time. So when they shocked their feet with the cherry blossoms, their brain became wired to that response, but it wasn't just in that generation of mice. For 3 more generations, every time those mice smelled cherry blossoms, they felt an anxiety response. Now, were they making the wrong proteins? No. They were making the proteins at the wrong time when they smelled cherry blossoms. They should have been making those proteins when they saw a cat, for example. They shouldn't have been making them when they smelled cherry blossoms. But if they lived in an area with lots of cherry blossoms, that would become a mouse that was hid out in their home, so to speak, and and had anxiety all the time and didn't go anywhere because they were afraid of getting cherry blossoms or smelling cherry blossoms. We could give those mice that had that pattern, that inherent pattern, that epigenetic pattern, we could give them mice Valium, for example, and try to calm their system, but that wouldn't really fix it, would it, unless we went to that epigenetic level and unwired that emotion of fear and that response in the brain. Well, that's what our work with QNRT, quantum neural reset therapy, does, is goes to that epigenetic level, unwires that emotional trauma and that brain wiring, so to speak, so that we can be as healthy as possible. So for example, in here with the future generations of mice, the problem wasn't really cherry blossoms, the problem was the pattern. And we see this all the time. People could be exposed to a virus, for example, in this pandemic that we've all went through. It activates an inherent weakness, or the early homeopaths called it a miasm or miasm. It activates this weakness or miasm, and then our health spirals down because we've already dealt with the current virus, we've already dealt with the current bacteria, but our problem now is the inherent pattern that was activated. So we don't need the virus treated, we don't need the bacteria treated, we need to work with the pattern. And this is amazing, amazing stuff. Now, the other thing you need to know is when we have suppressive healthcare therapies, that is steroids, antibiotics, and many other medications that can drive that inherent pattern, that epigenetic pattern, deeper into the system and make it harder to resolve. That's what the early homeopaths learned. And so we have emotional stresses that are triggered by shame, hurt, fear, anger, forgetting, and judgment. And then we have combinations of these miasms or miasms that came from the original homeopathic work and other work, that there are physical symptoms with those, there are brain symptoms with those, and there are common toxin vulnerabilities. And by vulnerabilities, I mean vulnerabilities to mercury or lead or nickel or gluten or sugar or carbs or mold or fungus, that sort of thing. So we have very specific patterns that we find and we unlock with our QNRT system so that people can be as healthy as possible. So I just want you to know that sometimes when we have an exposure or we have a significant stress, that stress or that exposure is no longer the issue. The problem is the inherent pattern, miasm, that was activated generationally often, that is spinning our health down, and we have to find that and unwire it. Just like with those mice, we have to find the pattern of fear associated with cherry blossoms and unwind that for those mice to be healthy. All the mouse Valium in the world isn't going to make them healthy. All the mouse Zoloft in the world isn't going to make them healthy. We have to unwind that pattern, that association, and when we do, the person can be as healthy as possible. So this is an amazing aspect of the QNRT work we do, and as you may or may not know, we have people come from 25 different states for this work. It's very powerful work, and we love helping people with it. And this is an additional concept that really helps the people who seemingly had been healthy. Something happens and then they spiral down in their health. It helps the people who are getting better and then something happens and then they crash and they have a hard time recovering. We see that periodically. And for those people, this aspect of our QNRT work is very, very powerful. And I want you to share this with people. This is a video you're going to want to watch again a couple times because there's so much information in here. I packed little bits of information in here that are so powerful and so take what we've understood from hundreds of years of healing and also what we understand from current information. Some of the current information I took on genetics and epigenetics was right from the CDC website. So this is cutting edge stuff, and I think that we can help many of you with it. I'm Dr. Michael Winters, Winters Wellness, Chiropractic Redefined.